The runway is meant to be a stage of dreams. Under the glow of spotlights, models transform into living works of art, carrying the ambitions of designers and the fantasies of audiences. But sometimes, behind the brilliance of the catwalk, shadows gather. Shadows that tell a story more haunting than any collection of silk or sequins. In 2006, Montevideo, Uruguay, became the unlikely center of one such story. A young model named Luisel Ramos collapsed shortly after finishing her walk. She was 22, at the beginning of what many thought could become an international career. 6 months later, her younger sister, Eliana, just 18, was also gone. 2 lives, 2 futures, extinguished in such close succession that the world could not help but search for meaning in the symmetry. Headlines spread across continents. Some reports suggested that the sisters had been victims of the fashion industry's obsession with thinness, linking their deaths to the pressures of the so-called size zero era. Journalists repeated rumors of restrictive diets and unforgiving standards. Yet their family denied these claims, insisting that the sisters were healthy and that a hidden medical condition, undiagnosed and cruel, had cut their lives short. Between the two accounts lay uncertainty, a silence that has never been fully broken. What is certain is the effect their story had. For the fashion world, it was a shock that could not be ignored. Conversations about health, body image, and responsibility erupted across Europe and South America. Within months, fashion weeks in Madrid and Milan began banning models below certain body mass indexes. Designers who had once praised fragile silhouettes now found themselves under scrutiny. Whether or not the Ramos sisters had been victims of the industry's demands, their names became forever tied to a global reckoning. Yet beyond the debates and reforms, there's something more intimate at the heart of this tragedy. The story of 2 sisters. Bound by love and ambition, they stepped into fashion with bright eyes and steady strides, supporting each other in a world that often asks too much. Their bond, their rise, and their sudden fall remind us that behind every face on the runway is a human life, one that can be as delicate as the fabrics it wears. This documentary will follow their path from Montevideo to the catwalks that celebrated them, through the whispers of rumors and the silence of loss, to the legacy that endures long after the applause has faded. The story of Luisel and Eliana Ramos is not only about fashion, it is about the fragile line between beauty and destruction, between ambition and survival, between light and shadow. Their lives began with promise, their ends came with mystery, and what remains is a question that still echoes in fashion's corridors. Were they victims of an industry's extremes, or of fate's cruel hand? The truth lies somewhere in the shadows, where their memory still walks. Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, is a city better known for its quiet charm than for producing global fashion icons. Yet it was here, in the early 2000s, that 2 sisters began a journey that would take them from local shows to international headlines. Luisel Ramos, the elder, and her younger sister, Eliana, grew up in a close-knit family, bound not only by affection, but also by a shared dream, to shine under the lights of the runway. Luisel was the first to be noticed. Tall, with angular features and a delicate frame, she caught the eye of local photographers and designers. In Uruguay, where the fashion industry was still modest, her presence stood out. Agencies whispered that she had the potential to go far, that her look could carry her beyond the borders of Montevideo. For her family, it was both exciting and daunting. Modeling was not a guaranteed path, but in Luisel, they saw a spark that could light the way. Eliana, only a teenager at the time, watched her sister's rise with admiration. In the privacy of their shared room, she practiced poses in the mirror, mimicking the elegance she saw in Luelsa. For Eliana, modeling was not only about beauty, it was about walking the same path as her sister, sharing in her triumphs, and proving that she too could belong in that world. Their bond made them inseparable, both in life and in ambition. The early years were filled with small shows, photo shoots, and casting calls. Uruguay's fashion scene was limited, but within it, the sisters became increasingly visible. Their names began to appear together in programs, their faces graced local magazines, and their appearances created a sense of anticipation. Side by side, they embodied the dream of youth and elegance, a double vision of beauty that seemed destined for something greater. Friends and colleagues from that time recalled their discipline. They were punctual, professional, and eager to learn. Behind their poise, however, was a shared pressure, the knowledge that the industry demanded more than charm. It demanded transformation, the ability to mold oneself into an image that designers wanted to project. Thinness was celebrated, delicacy was praised, and models were reminded in subtle and not so subtle ways that success often depended on their ability to conform. For the Ramos sisters, this reality shaped their journey. Luelsa, with her maturity, shouldered it with determination. Eliana, still so young, absorbed it almost unconsciously, as if her sister's choices were also her own. Together, they stepped into the world of fashion not as isolated individuals, but as reflections of each other, one leading, the other following, both chasing the same light. Though opportunities in Uruguay were limited, their names began to reach beyond the local circuit. Mentions appeared in regional fashion blogs, and designers spoke of their potential with excitement. For their family, it seemed that the sacrifices were worthwhile, that the sisters were on the cusp of something extraordinary. But even in these early days of rising success, there were unspoken questions. Could their delicate frames withstand the unrelenting demands of fashion? Were they pursuing the dream on their own terms, or were they being pulled by forces larger than themselves? At the time, such thoughts were drowned out by the applause. In hindsight, they read like the first shadows creeping into a story that would not end as anyone had hoped. The rise of Luelsa and Eliana Ramos was not meteoric, but it was steady, built on discipline, ambition, and an unbreakable bond between sisters. They were young, radiant, and full of promise. No one watching their early steps could have imagined how fragile that promise truly was. By the mid-2000s, the names Luisel and Eliana Ramos had become fixtures in Uruguay's modest but ambitious fashion scene. They were no longer simply young hopefuls trying to find their place. They had become symbols of a rising generation of models, admired for their elegance and their bond as sisters. Together, they stood out, not only for their beauty, but also for the story they embodied. Two young women walking the same path, side by side, under the glow of the same spotlight. Luisel, at 22, had developed a presence that captured audiences. Her stride on the runway was measured, confident, and graceful, the kind of poise that made clothes seem to float rather than hang. Designers praised her for her ability to disappear into the garments, to embody the ethereal detachment that was in vogue. There was something haunting about her look, a fragility that drew eyes without needing to demand them. Eliana, still only 18, brought a softer energy. Her resemblance to her sister made their pairing uncanny, like reflections of each other separated only by a few years. Side by side, they created an image of symmetry and harmony that few shows could ignore. When they appeared together, audiences leaned forward, captivated by the rare spectacle of two sisters sharing the same dream and shaping it into reality. For local media, the Ramos sisters became a story in themselves. articles spoke of them as Uruguay's answer to international supermodels, a promise that the small country could one day send its own stars onto the world's biggest runways. Photographers loved their contrast, Luisel's striking maturity against Eliana's youthful glow. Together, they seemed to offer a complete picture of beauty, one sharpened by experience, the other softened by innocence. But glamour, even at its height, often conceals its costs. The same qualities that drew admiration, delicacy, lightness, and almost weightless presence, also invited questions. How much sacrifice lay behind those appearances? Did the pursuit of the ideal come naturally, or did it demand more than anyone was willing to admit? Backstage, those who knew them sometimes noticed signs of exhaustion, the pallor beneath the makeup, the occasional weariness in their smiles. Yet in the world of fashion, such things were rarely spoken aloud. Thinness was not just accepted, it was rewarded. Fragility was mistaken for elegance, and silence covered what might otherwise have been warnings. Still, from the outside, the sisters seemed unstoppable. Bookings increased, photographers requested them by name, and their presence became an anticipated highlight of shows. To the audience, they were not struggling young women, they were stars in the making, gliding across the runway with effortless grace. Every show felt like a step closer to something greater, perhaps the chance to break into the international circuit, perhaps the recognition they had always dreamed of. It was their moment of triumph, their peak. But peaks in fashion are often precarious. Behind the applause and the admiration, there was a tension that no one could quite name. For the Ramos sisters, the very qualities that made them celebrated also made them vulnerable. Their beauty shone, but it was a light that flickered on fragile ground. In those days, no one watching could have predicted what would come. The audience saw only elegance, only promise. Yet the story of Luisel and Eliana Ramos was already carrying within it a darker chapter, one that would transform their names from rising stars to symbols of a mystery that still lingers on the runway. Applause has a way of masking fragility. On the runway, Luisel and Eliana Ramos appeared flawless, two sisters embodying the elegance that designers craved. But behind the images printed in magazines and the graceful walks under the lights, a quieter, more complicated story began to take shape. In the months before tragedy struck, rumors circulated about the pressures the sisters faced. Some reports suggested that Luisel had adopted an extremely restrictive diet, surviving on little more than lettuce and diet sodas. To many observers, this became a symbol of the size zero ideal dominating global fashion at the time. Yet their family and those closest to them rejected these claims, insisting the sisters lived as healthy young women, unburdened by destructive obsessions. This tension between what the media reported and what the family maintained remains unresolved. What is certain, however, is that the fashion world around them demanded a look that blurred the line between delicacy and danger. Thinness was applauded, fragility mistaken for grace. The Ramos sisters, admired for their ethereal presence, inevitably carried the weight of those expectations. Friends recall moments when fatigue showed through the polish. Backstage, the energy that radiated on the runway sometimes dimmed, replaced by weariness that no amount of makeup could hide. For Eliana, still in her teens, the pace of castings and shows was relentless. For Luisel, the responsibility of leading as the elder sister added another layer of pressure. Together, they bore it in silence, each step forward seeming to demand another sacrifice. And yet, to the outside world, they were radiant. Photographers saw only angles and light. Audiences saw only beauty. The cracks, if they were visible at all, were dismissed as the ordinary toll of ambition. In fashion, fragility itself was often treated as part of the allure. No one questioned it because to question it was to challenge the very system that thrived on appearances. The sisters walked their runways as though untouchable, yet the foundations beneath them were less certain. Whether their struggles were physical, emotional, or the hidden weight of a medical condition no one recognized, the truth was never fully revealed. What we do know is that the shine of glamour always carries a shadow, and in the case of Luisel and Eliana Ramos, that shadow was growing darker, even as their careers seemed to burn brighter. These were the cracks behind the image, small, silent, and unseen by most. They were not enough to dim the applause at the time, but they would soon split open in the most devastating way, turning admiration into grief and leaving questions that have yet to find answers. On August 2, 2006, Montevideo's fashion community gathered for a show like many before it. Models moved gracefully, designers revealed their collections, and the audience applauded. Among them was 22-year-old Luisel Ramos, poised and elegant as she completed her walk. But when she stepped backstage, the night changed forever. Luisel collapsed, and within minutes, she was gone. The shock was immediate. News outlets rushed to report, "Model dies after fashion show." Some framed it as the tragic endpoint of a harsh industry, linking her passing to speculation about extreme dieting and the size zero standard then dominating runways. Articles repeated claims of a restrictive lifestyle, saying she had consumed little in the weeks leading up to the show. Yet her family disputed this narrative. They maintained that Luisel had not lived that way, and that her sudden death was likely tied to an undiagnosed heart condition. With no official autopsy results made public, the truth remained clouded in uncertainty. Her passing could have been seen as a solitary tragedy, one young life lost too soon. But fate dealt another cruel blow. On February 13, 2007, just 6 months later, 18-year-old Eliana Ramos was found lifeless in her home. The symmetry was haunting. 2 sisters, 2 sudden deaths, bound together not only by blood, but by circumstances that seemed almost too cruel to believe. Once more, speculation filled the silence. Some journalists called it a catwalk curse, a grim phrase meant to capture the eerie repetition. Others pointed again to the pressures of fashion, using the sisters as evidence of how dangerous the industry's ideals could be. Yet doctors and family members emphasized a different perspective, that hidden health conditions, possibly hereditary, had gone undetected until it was too late. The absence of certainty left space for myths to form. The deaths of Luisel and Eliana became more than tragedies. They became symbols onto which people projected their fears, criticisms, and questions about the fashion world. Were they victims of an unforgiving system, or of fate's hidden hand? The answers were never fully written, leading only theories, rumors, and grief. For their parents and loved ones, it was unbearable loss. To bury 2 daughters within a year was a weight no family should endure. For Uruguay, the story carried a national sting. The country that had hoped to see its models shine abroad was instead associated with one of the industry's darkest headlines. For the fashion world, the sisters' deaths were a moment of reckoning. Whether or not the speculation was accurate, the perception mattered. Their names became rallying cries for reform, invoked in debates about body image, health, and responsibility. And yet beneath all the discussion, the central fact remained devastatingly simple. 2 young women, full of promise, were gone. The mysterious symmetry of their deaths gave the story a haunting quality that still lingers. One sister collapsed after a show, the other was found at home. Both gone before their lives had truly begun. Their final chapter raised questions that remain unanswered, questions about beauty, ambition, fragility, and the cost of chasing perfection. The loss of Luisel and Eliana Ramos reverberated far beyond Uruguay. 2 sisters, gone within 6 months of each other, became impossible for the fashion world to ignore. Whether their deaths were the result of industry pressures, hidden medical conditions, or some combination of both, the symbolism was undeniable. It was as if the runway itself had demanded a price too high to bear. International media quickly transformed their story into a cautionary tale. Headlines tied the sisters to the debate around size zero, a term that had already become shorthand for the industry's obsession with extreme thinness. Health experts pointed to their deaths as proof that change was urgent. Activists used their names in campaigns for reform. The sisters became more than individuals. They became emblems of what many saw as fashion's darkest reality. The pressure worked. Within months, Madrid's Fashion Week announced it would ban models whose body mass index fell below a set threshold. Milan soon adopted similar rules, requiring health certificates and stricter oversight. Other cities followed with discussions of how to protect models from dangerous standards. For the first time, global fashion acknowledged that beauty had boundaries and that crossing them could have lethal consequences. But the conversation was never simple. The Ramos family insisted that the portrayal of Luisel and Eliana Ramos as victims of anorexia was misleading and painful. They argued that undiagnosed cardiomyopathy, not self-destruction, was the true cause. Their words highlighted the tension between the private grief of a family and the public need for symbols. While the world debated ideals, the Ramoses were mourning the irreplaceable loss of two beloved daughters. Even so, the sisters' story reshaped the industry. Designers began to face scrutiny for the bodies they celebrated. Casting directors were pressured to think beyond numbers on a scale. Journalists continued to invoke the Ramos sisters whenever thinness on the runway stirred controversy. They became reference points in a conversation that continues to this day. What responsibility does fashion have for the health of those who carry its dreams? In Uruguay, the memory of Luisel and Eliana Ramos carried a different weight. They had been rising stars, representing a hope that the small country could shine on the international stage. Instead, their names became associated with sorrow and caution. Their story became part of the nation's cultural memory, a reminder of both the promise and the peril of chasing dreams in a global industry. Nearly 2 decades later, the legacy of the Ramos sisters remains unsettled. They are remembered as radiant young women, full of promise, whose lives ended too soon. They are remembered as symbols in a debate that forced the world of fashion to pause and reconsider its values. And they are remembered as daughters and sisters, mourned by a family whose grief was deepened by speculation. The aftermath of their deaths left scars on fashion, questions in journalism, and silence in their home. Whether change was enough remains debatable. Thinness is still praised, pressures remain, and tragedies still occur. Yet the memory of Luisel and Eliana Ramos endures, their story echoing in every discussion about what it means to demand beauty without cost. The story of Luisel and Eliana Ramos is one that refuses to fade. Two sisters, bound by blood and ambition, stepped into fashion with hope in their eyes, only to leave behind one of the industry's most haunting mysteries. Their rise promised brilliance, yet their fall left silence. Silence that has echoed across runways, newspapers, and living rooms for nearly 2 decades. Much has been said about why they were lost so soon. Reports tied them to the dangers of the size zero era, while their family pointed instead to hidden medical conditions. Between these accounts lies a truth that was never fully revealed. And perhaps that is why their story continues to grip us, not because we know exactly what happened, but because we don't. What we do know is that their lives changed fashion. After their deaths, rules shifted, conversations deepened, and the illusion of beauty without cost was harder to sustain. Whether or not those changes have endured is a question the industry still struggles to answer. But the names of Luisel and Eliana Ramos remain as reminders, delicate, tragic, unforgettable. They were daughters, sisters, dreamers. They were symbols, too, of how ambition can collide with fragility and how applause can sometimes hide a silent price. Their memory lingers not only as sorrow, but as a challenge to ensure that no stage, no dream demands more than life itself. As we close their story, one question remains. Has the world of fashion truly learned from the sisters' fate, or are the same shadows still waiting just beyond the lights? If you found their story moving, consider subscribing for more Untold Legacies.